I'm Alex Miller, Communications Associate with the EFI Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual event, Energy Demand, Jobs, and Growth, the Minnesota Model. Today's event begins with a fireside chat between Ernest Moniz, founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation, and Ryan Long, president of Xcel Energy, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. This will be followed by a panel of Minnesota labor, energy, and government stakeholders who will weigh in on strategies that can be used across the U.S. to build lasting coalitions that can work to meet energy demand and create jobs. We're going to go ahead and get into our fireside chat. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Moniz, the 13th U.S. Secretary of Energy, as well as founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation, and Xcel Energy's Ryan Long for a high-level overview of the clean energy transition in Minnesota and the surrounding region. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Moniz.
Great. Well, thank you, Alex, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, and thanks to Ryan Long for joining us here. I understand your territory is Minnesota and the Dakotas, but for truth in advertising, I have to say that I had a place until this last fall for more than 25 years in Xcel territory in Colorado. So I have lots of stories to tell, and so that's a bit of a warning, you know. But with that, in fact, let me first start by just asking you, Ryan, to why don't you describe kind of Xcel's overall footprint and where you are, how you operate, what your regulatory requirements are, what your big challenges and opportunities are going forward.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Dr. Moniz. Very looking forward to the conversation. As you mentioned, we operate in 8 different states, actually. My company operates in Minnesota and both North and South Dakota. We have a Wisconsin-based company that operates out of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and also serves part of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We have our Colorado company based in Denver, Colorado, serving Colorado and many of the mountain towns. And we also have Southwestern Public Service, which operates in the panhandle of Texas and eastern New Mexico. We serve in total just under 4 million electric customers and just over 2 million natural gas customers. And in terms of regulatory requirements, operating in 8 states, we obviously answer to 8 different public utilities commissions, which can be interesting, especially for companies like mine that operate in states like Minnesota and the Dakotas, which can take a different view of policy issues. We also obviously interact with the FERC and EPA and state environmental regulatory bodies as well, and the NRC. Specific to my company, we operate 3 nuclear units at 2 plants at Prairie Island and our Monticello plant, and so interact with the NRC on a regular basis as well. In terms of opportunities and challenges, I think they are sort of one and the same, because many of the opportunities present interesting challenges for us to grapple with these days. I think what we see in the industry and what we're feeling as a company right now is that we are still moving through an energy transition that we started quite a while ago. We are stepping through a series of coal retirements that in the upper Midwest will take us out of coal generation by 2030. We've been planning for that for quite some time. And so we remain committed to stepping through those retirements. But at the same time, we're seeing really significant growth and demand for the products that we sell on the electric side of the business. And so finding balance between those retirements and creating and building the resources that we need to serve an increasing demand for the product that we sell is an interesting and exciting challenge for us.
You mentioned the various public utility commissions, but are the regulatory structures fundamentally different in some of those states? Competitive markets and versus more traditional regulation, for example.
Yeah, we operate within traditional regulation in all of our states. So in Texas, which would be probably the most interesting example, we are outside of ERCOT in the SPP power pool. And so operate as a fully rate-regulated utility in all 8 of our states, and we're not in any competitive states.
Oh, okay. All right. So you have at least some consistency there.
That's right.
Okay, good. Well, that takes us actually challenges and opportunities to one thing which is on everybody's mind these days, of course, and that's load growth. A year ago, roughly, we had one of these webinars focused on Minnesota. And frankly, the question of load growth never came up. I'd be hard pressed to believe that we could have this conversation without having it come up. So Here it is. It's up. Why don't you talk a little bit about, I think you're projecting the order of maybe 2% per year. Some utilities, other parts of the country are projecting much higher rates even than that, although there is a lot of questioning about how reliable these projections are. Your thoughts on that would be welcome, especially for Minnesota.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting time to be in this business. And like you, a year and a half ago, we were having a much different conversation than we are today. After 17, 18 years of stagnant demand growth for electricity, we see the curves going substantially up and to the right. And, in large part, that's being driven, at least in the near term, by data center demand and hyperscalers in particular, that emerged, I think, in a new way since 2023 or so in the advent of large language models and generative AI. We had been working with data centers for more than 5 years, but the conversation really changed in 2023 from, us taking steps to try to attract those companies to the state of Minnesota to really them starting to knock on our door in a really significant way. So all of a sudden, we're inundated with customer requests. And I think today, across all 8 of our states, we have over 9,000 megawatts of customer requests outstanding and pending that have come in the door. And so, and for context for those listening, 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt data center by our math is equivalent to roughly about 1 million residential customers. And if you were to serve those with a mix of renewables and firm dispatchable generation, it's about 3 gigawatts of resource to serve a customer like that because of the high load factor. So it's been a really marked change to our business and how we think about the future and growth. You're right that we're projecting about 2 to 3% on the horizon. And, we spent a long time in 2024 trying to figure out, first of all, to your point, how much of this demand is real, right? How many of these customer requests overlap with other requests that are pending in other states and with other utilities for the same service and the same provision of data center development? And then also, how much do we think we can reasonably serve? Taking a look at our system, where we stand today, taking a look at our resource planning process and where we project we're moving over the next 5, 10, 15 years, how much of this data center growth do we think that we're actually going to be able to develop? And that's what has been factored into our projections of between 2 and 3% of growth over the coming years.
Are you submitting integrated resource plans on some regular schedule?
Yes, in Minnesota, we submit integrated resource plans that plan our entire generation system for Minnesota and the Dakotas. We submit them roughly every 3 years or so. We actually just wrapped one up and got commission approval of our plan in February of this year. We had filed that in February of 2024. We worked with various stakeholders and actually achieved a settlement in that docket, thanks to the leadership of the Department of Commerce and our labor partners, both of whom I think will be represented on the panel later this afternoon. And we're able to bring a settlement to the commission that was approved again in February of this year.
How much change was there from the load growth projections in the last IRP and this one?
Yeah, it's significant, actually. In fact, I have a chart that takes, when I give presentations, I have a chart that looks exactly at that. From our 2019 resource plan, what did our demand forecast look like? Sales forecast basically flat, a little bit of trickling upwards, reflecting some beneficial electrification and EV growth on our system, but it was really, really modest. And then if you look at our updated forecast of sales in our 2024 resource plan, there was a significant delta between those two lines. It's pretty dramatic. And that is kind of what is driving the 2 to 3% per year.
Mm-hmm. You referred, at least indirectly, maybe somewhat directly, actually, but let's say indirectly, to what are some pretty strong state greenhouse gas targets. Clearly, at least in other parts of the country, the strong load growth changes have created some tension between those plans for decarbonization and at least in the near and intermediate term, with meeting the load growth, which is viewed as pretty important for the economic development ecosystem, whether or not how many long-term jobs there are in a data center. The reality is that it's part of a broader ecosystem. And how do you see meeting simultaneously those needs for load growth and decarbonization?
Yeah, that is kind of the really challenging question here, and I think a lot of the work we did in 2024.
Isn't that why you're paid?
That's right. In 2024, that's where we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to strike that right balance, meeting the rising tide of this demand growth, but also staying true to our own environmental goals and the state's 2040 legislation, which really does provide a guiding light for us. That legislation was passed in 2023 and requires us to get to 100% carbon-free generation for our Minnesota customers by 2040 and has interim goals in 2030 and 2035. That legislation and those steps from now until 2040 were a pretty significant input into our analysis last year on how much data center load growth can we actually reasonably serve and still progress towards our goal of getting to 100% carbon free by 2040. We did that. We looked at our system. We looked at our projections and our resource plan and what we expect to add in terms of renewables and storage and some firm dispatchable generation on our system, and came out of that process saying, we think we can serve around 1.3 gigawatts over the next 7 or 8 years of data center load growth. And when we look at that and plug it into our model, we are confident that we can, first of all, remain on track for those 2040 obligations. And second of all, also remain on track for our coal retirements. We're retiring 3 coal units between now and 2030. We've been, again, planning for those for a long time. They're aging plants. They're somewhat inefficient plants. And we are blessed to live in a region that has really excellent renewable resources. And so we've been moving towards retirement of those coal resources, adding renewables on our system, as well as some firming resource on a transmission line that we're going to build called the Minnesota Energy Connection. And that is kind of what drove us to land at that number, because we remain confident that we can meet the state's goals, meet our own obligations, meet our commitment to retire our coal fleet and serve that amount of load growth and bring that economic development to our communities in the state of Minnesota.
You mentioned 2040 goals. What about the 2030 goals? What is the goal, first of all, and how are you on track? And won't will load growth essentially knock you off track?
Yeah. So the 2030 interim goal is 80% carbon reduction or 80% carbon-free generation for our Minnesota customers. And we're confident that we can serve this amount of data center load growth and still remain on track to hit that interim goal, as well as remain on track for the 2040 goal. Again, retiring our coal fleet is going to be a really significant input to meeting those metrics and ensuring that we retire both our King plant and our Schwagerl plant. But we really did take account of that into our modeling and decide this is the amount of load growth that we can serve and bring to Minnesota and still remain on track.
So, but the amount that you can meet, that sounded to be less than what you said is being asked for.
Yeah, it is. Well, it is 9,000 megawatts is an enterprise-wide number. So not just my company, but our Colorado company and our Southwestern Public Service company. But you're still right. Even if you were to divide that by 4, you're still right. And that's a new world for us to live in. And I think that it is not the position that we are taking that we're never going to be able to serve these customers. The question in my mind is, on what timeline? And I think that, as we're retiring our coal generation, I see these opportunities to partner with some of these hyperscale companies as a real opportunity to, first of all, partner on technological projects that will help us achieve our carbon reduction goals and get us to things like carbon-free firm dispatchable generation. And so in our position, it is trying to figure out what is the right partner for us to work with early and serve as a data center. How can we partner to achieve both of our, hopefully, goals that are aligned with respect to carbon reduction, which also aligns with the state of Minnesota, and leveraging that sort of partnership to get to a place where we think we can continue to serve more and more data center load growth while remaining on the path to getting to 2040.
You've talked a couple of times, Ryan, about retiring these coal plants, for example, by 2030. I think it was like 2 days ago, the Secretary of Energy invoked the Federal Power Act to call for a coal plant to be extended in its lifetime. I would just observe that some reacted to that by saying they never heard of this Federal Power Act authority. I can assure you I have. We used it when I was undersecretary in the Clinton administration in the year 2000 when California had their electricity crisis. So that emergency power is there. I guess one issue is there an emergency? And secondly, what's your take on that kind of invoking from Washington the Federal Power Act?
Yeah, it's obviously something that we're paying a lot of attention to, and I saw the announcements this week as well. I can say with respect to Minnesota and the upper Midwest, I certainly don't think there is an emergency. As I mentioned earlier, we've been planning for this a long time. It's not that we're going to retire these coal plants and walk away without a plan to replace that generation. In fact, our plan reuses those interconnection rights, both at our King plant and at our Sherco plant. We're building transmission. We're locating thousands of megawatts of renewables along a transmission line that is going to be anchored by a natural gas plant, combustion turbine at the end, bring all of that energy back to where that Sherco coal plant sits today and inject it into our transmission system. So I think that not only the company, but the state, our regulators, our stakeholders, our labeled partners, our environmental stakeholders have all been really thoughtful and planful in the way that we've approached these retirements. We started the process at the end of 2023 and retired our Sherco 2 coal unit, the first unit at our Sherco plant in Becker. And we did that with reliability. We've done that safely. We've done that while taking care of our communities and our employees, and we continue to proceed along that path. And so I am hopeful that that planful way in which we've approached these coal retirements resonates with the federal government, but obviously that's something that we are very mindful of and paying a lot of attention to. And I, like you, am aware of that authority under the Federal Power Act, but I used to be a lawyer. I'm not anymore. And so that's something we'll have to evaluate if we ultimately make it on a list.
I think the folks in Michigan who were the target of that Federal Power Act invocation said the same thing that they've been planning for a long time and have a hard time finding the emergency that would justify that need. Anyway, that's I think it's a very important development, obviously, and
I agree.
You also do, yeah. Okay. You've mentioned this transmission line several times. So, will you be importing more electricity from other states or Canada? And if from Canada, what happens with tariffs?
Yeah. So we would not be importing with respect to the Minnesota Energy Connection line. That's about a 190-mile line that runs from Becker, Minnesota down to Lyon County, Minnesota. So it is intrastate. And is really kind of what I consider to be a generation tie line. So it's going to locate generation all along that line, bring it back to the point of interconnection in Becker, and we'll inject into the transmission system there. But we do rely on a broader grid and a transmission system that stretches into other states. We obviously have, significant wind assets in both of the Dakotas, and we have a power purchase agreement with Manitoba Hydro where we import some power from Manitoba Hydro and have a diversity exchange there. We've taken a look at tariffs, and the answer is that given the nature of our contracts and the limited nature of electricity imports and natural gas imports that we bring from Canada, it's not a terribly material impact for our customers from an ultimate customer bill perspective, but it's something we've certainly been monitoring this year and we'll continue to look carefully at. Given the nature of our sort of exchange with Manitoba Hydro, though, it ends up not having a huge impact, especially on the electric side of the business.
Is that something that you have to plan carefully with MISO for the entire region?
Yeah, it is. And, we have changed the way that we go about resource planning at Xcel Energy. We used to model our system with what we say markets on, relying on a MISO broader grid to optimize our expansion plans and optimize the way that we build resources and serve customers. As we have seen baseload retirements occur across the MISO footprint, we became increasingly concerned about relying on MISO for reliability purposes. And we've talked to MISO about that, and they actually agree that we should plan our system to serve our native load with our own assets. And so in this last resource plan, we actually took what we call a markets off approach by turning markets off for purposes of setting our expansion plan and deciding what resources we need to build in order to serve our customers and the projected growth and demand for electricity on our system. And after we do that and establish our expansion plan, then we turn markets on for purposes of financially optimizing our system. So there are certainly times we're relying on other utilities or generation resources to serve our customers, but we're doing that as a financial benefit to our customers rather than relying on those system resources to reliably serve our customers.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned renewables several times. Could you just spell out what is your distribution today in terms of renewables, wind, solar, hydro, batteries? What are your plans to 2030 in terms of renewables expansion? And I guess the complement to that is, are you concerned about any reliability issues in terms of weather-dependent resources?
Yeah, so sitting here today, our system in 2025 is made up about 30% wind, about 4% solar, 6% other renewables, including the Manitoba hydro and some other hydro resources. As we look forward to 2030, we're going to increase our wind to about 44%. So almost half of our system energy generation will be wind. We'll double our solar to about 9%. And so as we think about reliability, those renewables are wonderful. And we are, again, in this very rich part of the country where we have excellent wind resource and good solar resource as well. But we have to back that up. Fortunately, we have nuclear facilities, which will become kind of our new baseload resource here in Minnesota after we retire our coal plants. And then we'll continue to back that up with our natural gas resources. And so we have taken the approach in Minnesota of trying to extend the resources that are already built, the steel that's already in the ground. So we have power purchase agreements that we're trying to extend to continue to serve our customers reliably. And then again, building this combustion turbine in Lyon County to back up the Minnesota Energy Connection line, which is something that was approved as part of the resource plan in February, but we've got a little bit more regulatory process to go forward on that one.
On wind, if I look, say, at Texas, and we did look at Texas, where, as you know, they have lots of wind, lots of turbines and lots of wind. But nevertheless, when we looked at the dispatch of wind for 1 year on an hour-by-hour basis, what we found was that there were 90 days of the year where actually there was very little wind. That's just the normal fluctuation. I don't know in Minnesota if it would be the same, but I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest. And so that brings us to the question, and if it's 90 days a year in Texas, what we found was that there were 9 days in a row, for example, with essentially no wind. And that backup power that you referred to would be absolutely essential. Of course, when that happened, they had a lot of gas. So how do you see that all coming together? You talked about this combustion turbine. So you see the gas growing in parallel, or gas capacity at least growing in parallel with the renewables?
I think that in the near term, gas generation is obviously going to be very important because you're right. And we see similar issues on the system where we think oftentimes about trying to solve 100-hour increment problems where we see kind of the system fairly devoid of wind at times. And I think solutions that include, first of all, nuclear plants, which we're going to continue to rely on, our gas generation that is already on our system and gas that we're proposing to add at Lyon County, but also storage. And, we are piloting the Form Battery Project, which is an iron air battery project that is 100-hour duration. We're piloting about a 10 megawatt battery. So it's a pilot project, but we're really excited to get that on the grid and start to interact with it on the grid and figure out what sorts of problems we're able to solve there. And I think that there are, storage technologies like Form hold a lot of promise for starting to solve some of those, durations that lithium ion batteries today are not very efficient at solving for us. But I agree with you in the near term, we are going to be leaning on our gas fleet in order to bridge some of the gaps as we step out of coal generation. And it will be important to maintain those resources on our system.
How does the regulator dialogue and the public dialogue evolve with that kind of complicated picture?
Yeah, our strategy in this last resource plan was, first of all, let's make sure we're maximizing the assets that are already in the ground, and ensure that if there is life left in some of our gas fleet, let's extend those projects. Let's renegotiate extensions to the PPAs and make sure that, first of all, we're taking advantage of the resource that we have. That is also, from a carbon perspective, pretty efficient because they're peaking resources and they sit there 90% of the time, oftentimes not running 95% of the time sometimes. But we did identify, needs on our system. And that's why we brought the Lyon County combustion turbine forward. That provides not only firm peaking generation that we think we need, but also grid attributes that are important as, you look at what happened in Spain recently and, the absence of spinning mass. So as we are taking off significant coal generation resources, we're thinking a lot about grid stability and how are we going to integrate these intermittent resources. And that drove us to conclude that we do need this combustion turbine to kind of anchor this Minnesota Energy Connection line and ensure that we're maintaining reliability.
So you have adequate spinning reserve, basically.
We do. And we're also, as part of these coal retirements, in some instances, when we bring these coal plants offline, we'll be adding synchronous condensers to ensure that we're keeping that spinning mass on the grid. And so, again, being very thoughtful in the way that we think about taking off these large generation resources that have served our customers for decades and decades, making sure that we're preserving the grid attributes that those provide, in addition to just capacity and energy that we think are really critical for reliability.
As you add more capacity on the grid and more wind in particular, it sounds like. Do you have now, or do you see developing some serious interconnection issues? You know, the whole issue of permitting, et cetera, for
interconnection has certainly been an issue, and a feature of our strategy has been trying to reuse as many of our interconnection rights as possible to avoid having to go through the internet connection queue and the study process at MISO, which obviously has taken a long time. We were paying quite a bit of attention to the ERAS proposal that MISO took to FERC that was rejected by FERC either last week or the week before. And we'll be watching and working with MISO to see if there's some other proposal that we can bring forward to bring on those critical reliability resources in a faster time frame as we start to, use up our current interconnection rights as we retire these coal plants. We're still going to need more resource, and I think we do need specifically a better and faster interconnection process at MISO to be able to add the resources that we need.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier, Ryan, that you operate these 3 nuclear reactors in the 2 plants, and I think you're also a member of a hydrogen hub. As I recall, Xcel was a pretty prominent player in that. How do you see these kinds of resources, low carbon, hydrogen, hopefully low carbon as well, coming in this firm power balancing of variable resources?
Yeah, we're very much an all options on the table utility as we think about what is going to be the technology that gets us to fully carbon free and firm. I think that nuclear is a piece of that puzzle for sure. We've obviously had that carbon free around the clock resource on our system since the late 1960s. And I think that the future of nuclear is looking brighter than it has maybe in any recent memory of mine, at least. And so we've seen North Dakota advance. Do
you mean in Minnesota, or do you mean more generally?
I mean across the nation. Minnesota has a moratorium, a statutory moratorium on new nuclear plants. There was a conversation at the legislature this year about potentially lifting that, but I don't think that's going to happen this session. But we are seeing states like North Dakota and states like Wisconsin actually pass siting studies and advanced nuclear studies. We hosted the Wisconsin governor at our Prairie Island plant just a couple of weeks ago. And so I think you're seeing interest grow. And, fortunately, the benefit of having a larger system, we share not only our system with the Dakotas, but also Wisconsin and Michigan, means that we can take a broader view of where we might be able to locate those resources. You asked about hydrogen as well. We are a member of the Hydrogen Hub. Obviously, with the federal administration change, a lot is moving quickly, and we understand the DOE is maybe going to be asking folks to reapply for some of the grants that were out there. We're watching and waiting to see whether the Hydrogen Hub is in the mix for that. And also, we were paying a lot of attention to Treasury guidance on the 45E tax credits last year. So we're in a bit of a monitoring mode with respect to hydrogen, and I think you see that broadly across the industry, but I continue to think that that is an interesting technology that could potentially solve the problem as well.
I might just say that at the Energy Futures Initiative, we were very deeply engaged in 45E, and we were public in saying that we were somewhat disappointed by the rules. Whether they are relevant any longer, we will see.
Right, that is it. I agree with you. We had the exact same reaction, and we have the same reaction today. Yeah.
Maybe a last question, because I know we're running out of time, but maybe you could say a few words about workforce development and how you see that, how you see jobs evolving. Certainly, we've done studies about clean energy jobs and found very, very substantial numbers, including in Minnesota. How do you see that happening? How do you see the training going, working with the unions and the like?
Yeah, I've already mentioned our labor partners as part of the resource plan settlement, and we're incredibly grateful for our partners here in Minnesota. We have a really strong labor force. We have a really strong group of unions that we work with, even before we file a resource plan, to get feedback. And then we partner through the resource planning process. They are a stakeholder. They bring their viewpoints. They shape our viewpoints. And we've been in that position with them for a long time. And so it is a partnership that has really pay dividends for us. And I think what is important as we look out on the horizon is that we're sharing information with each other, ensuring that they are ready for the work that is coming, because there is a lot of construction and work to get done over the next half a decade and decade beyond that. And ensuring that we're sharing that with them and they understand that it is, imperative that we have a workforce that's ready to do this. We participate in training programs. We have helped fund some training programs to bring more diversity into some of our unions, which has been a really great experience that came out of our last resource plan. So we take their feedback really seriously. We sit down regularly and we're in constant conversation, and we're really grateful for the partnership here in Minnesota.
Well, I wish we could go on. I think there's a lot of these planning issues are so critical, but I think we'll have to wait for the next webinar to further elaborate. So, Ryan, thanks very much, and appreciate it. And we also stand ready to collaborate and cooperate whenever we can be helpful. So, thank you
very much.
I'm going to turn it back to Alex, I think, to head into the next panel.
Well, this concludes our fireside chat. Thank you both, Dr. Moniz and Mr. Long, for your insights. It was a great foundation for the rest of our discussion today. I'd like to now introduce our second session, which is a panel of Minnesota experts here who are going to discuss their perspectives on the state's energy transition. This panel will be moderated by EFI Foundation Distinguished Fellow David Foster. Dave, thank you for moderating, and feel free to go ahead and introduce our excellent panelists for today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alex. And I also want to thank former Secretary Moniz and Ryan Long for an excellent conversation, especially one that described in great detail the development of the IRP in Minnesota that was done with aggressive goals in terms of lowering carbon emissions in the state of Minnesota, but also meeting the very significant resource demands that is now coming up. And so as an important part of that IRP, as Ryan Long said, were all the other stakeholders who contributed ideas, and eventually that was very successfully approved. So I would like to introduce that panel now for some further reaction and discussion, starting with Margaret Cherne-Hendrick, the CEO of Fresh Energy, a Minnesota nonprofit that is focused on equitable carbon neutral economies. Joe Fowler, the business manager of the Laborers International Union of North America, Local Union 563, which has jurisdiction over most of Minnesota and North Dakota. Ryan Hentges, the CEO of Dakota Electric, a member-owned distribution rural electric co-op located south and east of the Twin Cities, and which is also hosting one of the proposed state data centers. Then Sydnie Lieb, who is Assistant Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Commerce, which administers the energy and utility programs in the state. And finally, Ann Schwagerl, the Vice President of the Minnesota Farmers Union, which has been advocating for Minnesota farmers and their communities for over 100 years in our state. So I very much appreciated the conversation between Secretary Moniz and President Long, because I think that conversation provides a model for how other states could be having these conversations themselves. I would like to start by asking each of you to just quickly give your reactions to the conversation you just heard, what you learned from it, and what benefits that can provide others from around the country listening to these same problems and trying to figure them out in their own location. So Sydnie, as someone who works for the state of Minnesota, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, David. I think coming out of this conversation, one of the things that we're really thinking a lot about at the state is that in the absence of the federal government continuing to push development and deployment of clean, firm resources, we're thinking about where the state has a role in creating incentives and policies that are going to push those technology deployments, as it's really important to make sure that we're bringing clean, firm resources onto the system to replace the retiring coal baseload and to get away from gas being paired with renewables so that we can achieve a truly carbon-free electricity system. And I think the second thing that's really important from the state perspective, as we're thinking about this load growth that was being discussed, is recognizing that in Minnesota, we have a really robust planning environment. And we have a traditional resource planning environment, but we also have a distribution system planning environment, and we have, through our PUC that dovetails with the overall regional market, a transmission planning system. And traditionally, these things have occurred in sort of siloed buckets. And as the system is becoming more interrelated and the types of resources that we have on the system are becoming more complex, it's going to be really important for us to make sure that we're integrating the distribution system, generation planning, and transmission planning so that we can ensure compliance with the 0 by 40 mandate, and we don't allow load growth from large data centers, AI, and onshoring of manufacturing to be a reason that we abandon these clean energy requirements. And in addition to really having a robust planning environment that's looking at the load growth and planning for compliance, we can also look at these loads as a way to support the transition to clean energy, looking at how much demand flexibility we can see in these types of loads so that we can take them off the system peak, and also looking at novel ways to partner in generation investment with these large resources that also oftentimes have their own sustainability goals.
Great. Thank you, Sydnie. And Joe, from the perspective of labor, how have you looked at this?
Well, there was a lot to cover with what Ryan and Secretary Munoz were going over, but we do try to partner with the utilities here in Minnesota, whether it's Xcel, which we have a very, very long history with the building trades going back to the construction of their nuclear plants, their coal plants, et cetera. I actually live in the community right next door to the Becker plant, which is transitioning, shutting down, and we're currently on site building solar farms. We partner with them in a way that we say we need to be involved in the next iteration or the next development or the next part of how we're going to develop energy here in Minnesota. What does that look like? We have to make sure our members have their fears allayed. You know, there's folks who have built their entire careers going to one location, whether it's a Sherco power plant, which is coal, Riverside, which transitioned to gas. You know, they're used to going the same location every day. We need to transition those folks maybe from coal or refuse power production into solar, wind, hydrogen, possibly, depending on where the funding is, you know, for some of the tax credits, et cetera. And in having those conversations with the different utilities, we try to work through a plan that makes sure that there's job opportunities for our members to transition and keep those careers, because in our industry, our job is literally to work ourselves out of a job. Generally, we build something, we move on to the next project, whether that's a solar farm or a wind farm. We've taken that into account. And that goes for multiple trades, not just the laborers that I represent, in adding increased capacity in their training, curriculum, whether that's adding new curriculum. I could say for the laborers, we purchased 96 acres here recently because we outgrew kind of the training center that we have for some of the new curriculum that we're doing, whether it's wind tower maintenance, whether it's involved with solar, et cetera. So we're trying to make sure we're ready for what comes, while at the same time understanding that it's a little bit fluid. The IRP gives us a longer outlook, or as long as we can have, but whether the funding is there, whether coal is somehow undone, the shuttering of some of those plants and they stay viable, we want to be able to provide that workforce and do it at a local level so that those communities that are affected by any of those power production resources shutting down still have a good tax base, still have job opportunities at a local level, and that money gets spent back in the community. So I think it's a win-win. And when we work, like I said, with whether it's Xcel, whether it's Minnesota Power, Otter Tail, or another co-op, if we can have a communication on the front end as they're going in front, before they go in front of the PUC, then we can be there to advocate that it includes the prevailing rate, that it includes local hire workforce, and that, you know, we have the workforce through the different 14 affiliated trades to meet those needs. Renewable energy, some of those take a reduced amount of trades. You know, licensed electricians are involved in almost any type of power production. And then it falls heavily on some of the general trades for wind and solar. But we talked about, I think there's 10 different data centers that are driving some of those energy demands. We love building those too. And that takes a lot more of the trade. So everybody gets to be involved. Everybody is ready for that and supportive of, what it takes to grow the energy industry here in a way that's carbon free or carbon neutral, because we have goals to meet, and it's our job to make sure our utility partners have the workforce they need to get there. And we haven't failed yet, and we're a pretty collaborative group in what we need to do to work together with them amongst the trades. So I'm confident we'll meet those needs.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Joe. And now I'd like to jump to you, Ann, to talk to us a little bit about rural Minnesota and how farmers have reacted to all this that you've heard today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks, David. Farmers fill this really interesting dual role in a changing climate, right? We are on the front lines of the climate crisis every day on our own farms, while being also expected to kind of lower our own GHG emissions, produce more with less, continually being asked to improve our farms and our production systems. Minnesota Farmers Union has a deep roots within the cooperative movement. As a general farm organization, we pushed historically for the Rural Electrification Act and the formation of the rural electric cooperatives, working to build rural wealth with our own local ownership of our own electricity. Today, we're still really deeply involved with our RECs and support the clean energy transition because our members know that wind and solar opportunities for farmers are a potential source of income. And in fact, in the last few years, MFU produced a farmer's guide to wind and solar on their own farms because we know that it's an enterprise opportunity. We did that in partnership with the Farmers Legal Action Group and are hoping to update it here as we move through the next set of political wins that we find ourselves in. But also, at the same time, again, this dual role, we know that wind and solar development is presenting a concerning trend of using up prime farmland. From our perspective, and as it's always been, local control is critical here. And so this conversation is very timely for farmers across the state of Minnesota.
So Ryan, that's a great introduction to jump into someone who runs one of the rural electric co-ops. What's your reaction to what you've heard so far?
So, yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, a couple of things I'd say for this portion is what's exciting is exciting, but also something that we have to watch is the timelines and the impact of those timelines. And what I mean by that is with this additional growth, it's changes both for us as utilities, as organizations, but also communicating what the reality of some of those timelines are with our partners. So when we're thinking about it as a utility, we haven't seen growth in overall electric sales since 2007. We're entering an environment in which that's going to likely change. It's changing rapidly, as was previously discussed. Getting our organization up to speed to meet that in a way that we continue to provide the member service that we've done in the past, with continuing to have an eye for the future. There's also the understanding around the timelines as when this load will happen. And sometimes we talk about data centers and we say 1 gigawatt, 3 gigawatts, 9 gigawatts, whatever the number may be, and it seems as if it's going to happen next year. We need to start planning, but it happens over time. And I think that allows us some flexibility in how we move forward. So those are just a couple of quick reflections that I had listening to the previous conversation.
Thank you. And now, Margaret, I'd like to turn to you as an advocate for one of the primary environmental and clean energy advocacy organizations in Minnesota. What was your reaction?
Yeah, thank you, David. Appreciate being here. And like you said, for folks who are not familiar, Fresh Energy is a 30-year-old Minnesota-based nonpartisan nonprofit clean energy advocacy organization. So we work alongside all the folks on this call, including Xcel, to shape and drive bold policy solutions to achieve equitable carbon neutral economies, both in Minnesota and the Midwest. So I think this has been a really fulsome conversation so far, and I might focus my comments a little bit on really large energy users like data centers, which are of really high topic of conversation even with our current legislative session, which because we're heading into a special session is not quite done. But we see this as both a challenge and an opportunity within the larger energy transition, where we are working towards being carbon neutral by state law by 2050, and then also compliant with our 100% clean electricity law, which again requires utilities in Minnesota to serve customers with carbon-free electricity by 2040. So of course, the challenges here are really infrastructure based, with an electricity system due to massive new electricity demand. We've got to make sure we're meeting statutory requirements, and we're hoping that that is going to include backup generation, especially germane to large data centers that need to be operating 24/7. And we also simultaneously need to meet new electricity demand for other end uses moving off of fossil fuels across the economy. So we have work to do in Minnesota to bring down emissions in the transportation and building sector, as well as in the industry sector as well. So we want to be working to bringing on large energy users like data centers, but not at the exclusion of accommodating other users that are going to need to electrify. And of course, there are larger environmental and societal challenges with large water demand, siting concerns, et cetera. So, we're really trying to weigh those challenges, work through them, but then also lean into some of the opportunities that we see. In terms of affordability, there's a real opportunity to bring down electricity rates, putting downward pressure on electricity prices. The more volume of electricity you sell, it kind of pays for the fixed costs, even with the additional infrastructure that we need for building out. And then putting together savvy rate design, which should require data centers to pay extra costs for required infrastructure, and advocating for a large energy user rate class to specifically capture these large energy users, and really making sure that the ratepayers themselves are going to be held harmless for this work. And we see opportunities for community benefits too. So large energy users should be helping to speed the energy transition here in Minnesota, especially for communities that are going to be impacted. And we see opportunities to help pay into, for example, energy efficiency and weatherization funds that are going to help offset the loss that we're going to see with some federal programs that have been really integral to making life easier for Minnesotans, like LiUNA. And of course, as Joe already discussed, we'll have jobs and increase to local tax base as well. And I think it's important to note that Minnesota's clean energy commitments are a key reason why data centers want to locate in Minnesota. We aren't a low tax or an easy permitting state, and even in the face of federal signals that make it easier to move away from sustainability goals, we're still seeing companies looking at Minnesota as a long-term place to do business, which we think is important.
So heading into a second round of questions here, Joe, you talked already to some extent about the ability of the building trades to meet the labor demand. Are there any challenges, and what are the specific benefits that you think other Minnesotans are going to get out of this?
I think the benefits other Minnesotans will get out of it is, partnering with the utilities is just in general, hopefully continued affordable, low cost or average cost to low cost electricity. Having available electricity literally at the flip of a switch is something that everybody has come to expect and they need. So with the growth of the energy production that's needed to accommodate these different projects, including data centers, but that not being the only thing, I think that is something that's important that Margaret had mentioned as well. With that draw, we need to make sure that everybody gets the energy that they thought they were going to have at the light flip of a switch, while at the same time maintaining cost effectiveness of providing that utility. As far as the second part, I think, of the question, or like how we're meeting that need? Was that, correct me if I'm wrong, David, how we're meeting that need? Ryan mentioned earlier, we're trying to hit it from all angles, whether it's diversity on both a gender and a racial basis. They help support a group called Building Strong Communities, which is multiple affiliate program recognized across the nation as one of the leading programs. I think we just graduated a little over 100. I might be a little shy. It might be 120, but a little over 100 folks, both veterans, women, and BIPOC community members that are getting opportunities in energy production projects. They're getting opportunities to go work at the data centers. So we're doing good things in trying to expand the opportunities to folks, economic opportunities to folks who may not have gotten them. And I think there's benefits that the state will see from that, from an increased tax base. But just in general, having citizens who feel like there's opportunity out there, or that if you're transitioning from one, that you didn't open another door, right, with another project that's coming down the road. And they may not be able to see that right now, the individual member or employee, but as long as those opportunities are there when they need them, I think we're doing what we're supposed to do. We're a partner with the utility to make sure that they can build those different assets out. Could even be distributed solar if we have some of those interconnection and permitting issues. And that's some of the conversation that we can have with the utilities if that's something they need as well. But I mean, the advantages is it's strong energy production at a good cost, an affordable cost, that provides good paying jobs with, retirement, with family sustaining wages and benefits. I mean, that's just, we all do better when we all do better, and a rising tide lifts all boats. So there is ancillary benefits to folks outside of just our membership when everybody's working. And we're committed to trying to make sure everybody's working.
Okay. I wasn't quite sure what happened to our other panelists since they dropped off, but I'm assuming that they are still there and they will be brought back on when they start speaking. And I wanted to ask you to dig in a little more about some of the involvement the Minnesota Farmers Union has had in the Heartland Hydrogen Hub project. And what is it that really interests the Minnesota Farmers Union in something like that?
Yeah, sure. I'm back. I've focused so far about energy and clean energy production, but cooperative ownership for us in particular relates to the Heartland Hydrogen Hub. It's a little bit of a mouthful there. Farmers Union was, of course, very supportive of the IRA tax credits laid out and the hydrogen hubs, especially as it relates to the support of the production of green ammonia. Whereas currently the fertilizer industry is heavily consolidated, and much of our fertilizer inputs are produced on the Gulf Coast and barged up the Mississippi River. We're excited about research that's been done over the last several years at the University of Minnesota into scalable, locally produced green ammonia made with wind energy. We're particularly excited about projects that are owned by cooperatives. And in fact, in 2023, we supported the legislation that was passed and funded a green fertilizer grant program administered by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that provides funding into agricultural and rural electric cooperatives to invest in green fertilizer production located here in Minnesota. This works to mitigate the risk for accessing critical inputs, which is within a shrinking weather window that we have during planting season, peak planting season here in Minnesota, while also stops the flow of annual wealth out of Minnesota into mega corporations, many of them foreign owned, and keep that wealth rurally within Minnesota, within farmer-owned cooperatives, rural resident-owned electric cooperatives. Our thinking here at Minnesota Farmers Union is that the green transition is happening. We're seeing it in agriculture, just like the energy sector is living it right now. And it would be a big bummer to us if it ended up being owned by the same multinational mega corporations, right? Rather than locally owned, locally controlled by farmers.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's such an interesting perspective. Ryan, could we talk a little bit about the electricity demand building for data centers? Because you're facing this challenge from a rural electric co-op perspective. What goes through your mind as you try to answer to the demands?
Yeah, so a variety of things. In really just as background, it's important to know we have right now our average load at Dakota Electric's right around 250 to 300 megawatts, maybe peaking up to 500 megawatts in the summer. And we've had requests for up to 3 gigawatts worth of service. The first one that came through at 1 gigawatt, we actually, our initial response was no thanks. It was just too much, too fast, too much risk. It just wasn't something that we thought made sense for us. But we continue to work the problem and think about it, and really wound up with the conclusion that if we can do it safely, reliably, and affordably, then we have an obligation to serve, and we're going to meet that obligation. So we really rolled up our sleeves, began working with the data centers, the hyperscalers, to figure out what might this look like. What's interesting is through that process, we really changed from looking at it as just an obligation to really an opportunity. And that's really where we're at now. We don't have any signed contracts, but we have been working with organizations. So when I say opportunity, I want to highlight maybe 8 areas, and some of them have already been mentioned earlier. But from our perspective, it's an opportunity to partner as a utility with innovative and similarly minded organizations. As an example, one of the first conversations we had with a hyperscaler, we mentioned in order to establish any contract, we are going to meet the state 2040 carbon free. And we thought there may be some pushback or something. And their only question was, well, can you meet it sooner? Which was great. Okay, now we're on the same page and we can really start moving forward on that. So there's opportunity there. There's opportunity to strengthen our local infrastructure through investments in transmission. Again, with hyperscalers of helping or funding those entirely. There's the financial benefit, the opportunity to financially benefit our existing members. As I mentioned earlier, we haven't had load growth since 2007. Our costs continue to go up, and additional sales will help that. There's an opportunity for us to show that we can add significant load and still meet the carbon reduction goals in Minnesota's carbon-free 2040 state law. Now, admittedly, it's not going to be easy, but it's necessary for us to innovate with capable partners and meet the future economic needs of our region. There's the opportunity as well to show that a distribution system can be part of that load growth, the answer to load growth, specifically virtual power plants, a variety of items along those lines that have benefits from a resiliency perspective as well. I'm noticing we're running close on time, so I'm going to kind of draw it to an end and just say, we've really transitioned from no thanks to seeing it as an obligation to seeing it as a significant opportunity that we're really focused on. Cooperatives across the U.S. have succeeded in this, and we plan to be able to do the same in Minnesota.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan. Margaret and Sydnie, I'd like to call you both back for just a quick discussion on the same question, which is that we've seen a great many changes in the federal regulatory front. We've talked about a couple of them in the course of this discussion already. And some of them may seem to be in direct contradiction with the plans we have in Minnesota. How are you processing that, and what are you thinking about doing it? Maybe give us a minute, each of you, to just think about that. Margaret, we'll start with you, and then Sydnie, you can wrap it up.
All right, I'll go quick. We're keeping an eye on all of the, I think we've heard some IRA tax production credits bandied about here. 45V for green hydrogen in particular is of interest to us. 45Z on some of the sustainable fuels development as well. So I think to some of Anne's points, we're really aware of other potential large energy users coming onto the landscape, separate and apart from data centers, that we really want to make sure get into the planning process. So markets that haven't fully developed in Minnesota yet, but there's a lot of interest: sustainable aviation fuel, green fertilizer, and clean steel, I think, are all ones that we would anticipate being reliant on green hydrogen, of course, which requires renewable electricity to run, and large amounts of it at that. And then we're also very aware that we've got a lot of low and mid heat industrial processes here in Minnesota already. And those markets are demonstrating emissions rises as well. And we need to electrify those. Those are all electrification potentials there. So making sure that we've got those in the forecasts as well in our IRP planning processes to make sure that we're not planning for data centers and data centers alone, and that we're planning for really an economy-wide transition.
Great. And Sydnie, the last word on how the state of Minnesota is thinking about this challenge.
Thanks, David. I think similarly, we're recognizing that it may be difficult to, or slow or more costly to build and permit the resources that we have approved in our resource plans. And I think while we're fully committed to that, we're also looking at what other types of resources we can bring on the system. One important thing we're looking at are grid enhancing technologies to make sure that the existing resources, that we're getting the full value out of those. And we're going to have utilities submitting their first grid enhancing technologies plans to the commission this year to make sure that we're optimizing the investment in existing transmission lines to make sure we're getting the full amount of energy that's at the end of those lines into our load centers. Similarly, I think we need to start thinking more carefully about congestion of existing resources, how we can site loads in areas that are congested, how we can be looking at batteries to reduce congestion and make sure that we're getting, again, the full value out of the resources that ratepayers have already paid for, that are already on the system. And I think the last thing is going to be looking at virtual power plants and distributed resources, and recognizing that these are going to be the fastest resources that we can deploy are going to be demand response, virtual power plants, and distributed resources, where we may not need to build a large transmission line. These are things that are already existing near load centers. And these may be some of the lowest cost resources we can utilize because they have avoided transmission costs, and they may also rely on already existing resources that may not be utility owned. So they're going to be able to contribute to the system in new ways at a lower cost for ratepayers.
Great. Well, I want to officially thank you all for having taken part in this discussion. We're out of time, but we have a group of panelists who I think have demonstrated to the rest of the country the capacity for states to look at the challenges in front of us with both energy demand and the desire to decarbonize the electricity system, and see that collaboration together is a model that actually works. And that's something that in Minnesota we've demonstrated, and we hope the rest of the country can learn to follow this model. Thank you very much.